Hi, I'm Bob Mayer at the COR division, and me and Satan are going to talk to you today about pedagogy, COR 110, 120. Why Satan? Because for some people, interdisciplinarity is hell. Shouldn't have to be, though. Get rid of the devil. The problem people have with being a teacher in an interdisciplinary course often is they think they have to do everything. They have to be a master of every subject they cover. This is nonsense. Most of us aren't even masters of the things we claim to have PhDs in. Our skill lies in being able to interpret and sort of repurpose things towards the goals that we have for our students. And our goals are laid out in our learning outcomes, in our course outcomes, in the sorts of things in our mission statement, the type of things we need our students to have to be sound and creative and productive professionals. What we do in the COR helps make them that, and it also does so in a way that expands their horizons and helps them connect with the humanities. We do that by giving them interdisciplinary courses, and the purpose of interdisciplinarity is interdisciplinarity. It's not to give students firm groundings in a variety of subjects. In a single introductory level course, Psych 101, History 100, something like that, we used to teach ourselves or tell ourselves or lie to ourselves that when students took these courses they would get a fundamental grounding in this one discipline. We knew it was relative nonsense then, and we know it's even more so now. If we're teaching a course with 4, 5, 6 different disciplines, how on earth can we expect students to have a fundamental grounding in all of them when we really know in the past we couldn't give them a fundamental grounding in 15 weeks in one discipline? We don't have to. That's the whole joy of this, and the beauty of it is that the total of it, the parts, are greater than their individual worth. I want to talk a little bit about how you can do this in the first 2 courses of the COR, which are intensely interdisciplinary and intentionally interdisciplinary. All COR courses are interdisciplinary, but the first 2, COR 110, Concepts of Self, and COR 120, Concepts of Community, are designed in such a way to force even the most unwilling and obstinate of faculty to engage in interdisciplinary pedagogy. And I think that pretty much all of us have adopted that and adapted to that very well because it's fun and it gives us enormous scope for personalization. But I want to talk a little bit about how one approaches these things when we may not know squat about the topic, or at least we don't think we do. Lesson number 1, you know a lot more about each of these things than you think. The fact that you've been around, that you've gone through graduate school, that you've been teaching, that you know people, that you have a life, gives you a lot of insight into these disciplines. More importantly, as a trained scholar, you know how to tease out information, critical path of analysis and logic, and you know how to present things in such a way that the students will grasp them. You have a leg up there. As I tell my students, I'm no smarter than you, I just happen to know a bunch of more things because I'm older than you are, or I've done different things. But in terms of raw intelligence, I make no claims, and we don't need it. That's the best thing about it. So, for instance, let's see some of the books that we use in COR 110. Let's take Linden, right, the Pumpkinhead book. Terrifies a lot of people. Why? He's a neuroscientist. He's at Johns Hopkins. He's brilliant. He's kind of annoying, but he's brilliant. This book is full of biochemistry. I don't know about you. My PhD's in history, my master's is in political science. I go squat about biochemistry. Doesn't matter. Why? Because I'm intelligent, I can read this thing, I can get the basics of it, so can the students. But more importantly, we're not teaching them biochemistry. What are we teaching them? How a scientist looks at the world. It's epistemology. How does a scientist know something? Well, a scientist knows something because he follows a scientific, or she follows a scientific method. They are empiricists. They use data. They're quantifiers. And Linden outlines in great detail in these chapters how a scientist approaches the problem of the self. In this case, the biological self, or why we do this or that, based upon physiological chemical reactions. That's what we need to know. It's not really important that we know the actual chemistry involved here. What's important is that Linden, as a scientist, approaches who we are and how we act and what we do and why we do it from the perspective of an empiricist, from a scientific perspective, from the perspective of somebody who needs quantified, repeatable data to make their decisions. We use this book to show the students how a scientist thinks. Sure, they will learn some neuroscience, they will learn some biology, they will learn how a physiological aspect of ourselves is crucial to who we are. But any of us can deal with that. You don't have to be a scientist to do that. In fact, I would argue strongly against getting too much in the weeds of this stuff because there's no payoff. If the students really want to do chemistry and biology, we have classes they can take. But we're not doing them a service if we try to master this, because we'll do a half-assed job at it. And they'll do a half-assed job at it, and everybody will be unhappy. Take it for what it is, an introduction to the mind of the scientist. That's what's really important here. Same with this book, a brilliant book compiled and edited by Roger Hawk, which is basically 40 of the greatest studies in psychology. Now, everybody thinks they understand psychology, but obviously it's a lot more complicated than that, and most of us aren't psychologists. But we're familiar with most of these studies, and the students should be too. What's the purpose of this book? Well, again, it's to tell you how a psychologist thinks. Psychologists sometimes are scientists, sometimes they're social scientists, sometimes they're more philosophers. Depends on who you're talking about. But there are certain things psychological studies have in common. There's generally some sort of experimental method, there's generally some sort of data collection and analysis, and essentially what we're teaching the students is how a psychologist approaches the question of human behavior, the self, through the eyes of the psychologist. Sometimes it's related to how Linden sees it in terms of data gathering and the sort of brain chemistry and stuff. Other times it's much more like a philosopher's approach to things, as when we're looking at Skinner or someone like that, or Milgram, when they're looking at the sort of social, cultural factors that make us do what we do. The important thing, again, is not to master the language of psychology or the rhetoric of psychology, although those are very interesting and useful things to know, but the methods and, again, the epistemology of the psychologist. How does the psychologist know something? Well, that means they look at data in a certain way, information in a certain way, just like a scientist does. There may be some overlap, but they're fundamentally different in how Linden, for instance, and Milgram are going to look at why people do what they do. Or, Bem in her study of gender is going to be a lot different than Linden when he talks about sex and love, because of where they're coming from. That's what we get across to the students. The details of that, in terms of how these projects or experiments are handled, are sort of ephemeral to what we're really trying to do. Freeland's book, Portraits and Persons, she's an art philosopher. Sort of an interesting combination there, right? Again, from the art perspective, we certainly aren't trying to tell them how an artist approaches things. We're all artists in our own ways, and, I'm not sure you could generalize. But in terms of the art world as an academic subject, as the way art is looked at and known by people who study art, and the way art is sort of intertwined with our philosophy, there is a particular epistemology. There's a particular way of knowing that the artist and the art critic and the art historian and the art philosopher uses. So by using Freeland, you do not have to get deep into the content of what she's talking about. You do have to understand that she is looking at art in a different way than we would. She's looking at it from the perspective of a philosopher of art and aesthetics. And when we learn that, then we could look at ourselves in that same perspective, the same way we do with a scientific perspective or a psychological perspective. What we need to know is how to look at those questions, what's important to an artist, what's important to an art philosopher that may not be important to the scientist, but does inform that sort of mode of inquiry. So our pedagogy is centered around helping students grasp that macro scale approach to this discipline, not the micro. It's even better with Shakespeare here. I love Shakespeare. Most everybody who thinks we're a right-thinking person loves Shakespeare. Shakespeare is great. Shakespeare is funny. Shakespeare is interesting. Students may have a different opinion initially, but that's okay. Our job is not to convince them. It's to help them understand why we're looking at Shakespeare. And again, it's epistemology. Shakespeare is a playwright. He's a businessman. He's an observer of human nature. He's an operator and a player in Elizabethan England. He's trying to make a living as well as trying to make art. I have no earthly idea whether Shakespeare sat down in the morning and saying, I'm going to write great art. I do have a pretty firm idea that he says, where's my next meal coming from? So when we look at how a playwright approaches social issues, we get involved in a whole bunch of things. There's a psychological aspect of it. He's one of the greatest observers of human nature that ever was. There's sort of a technical aspect of it. How do you construct a narrative? How do you construct a drama to get the most out of your audience, but also to convey what you need to do in a way that is different from a scientist or a psychologist or an artist, but in some ways encompasses parts of all of them. When we read Shakespeare, yes, it's important to sort of understand what happens in, for instance, Othello. But more important is to understand that here we have another way of getting at what goes on inside of here and who we are. It's a way of looking that is free of the empirical data collection requirements of the scientists, that is free of the methodological rigor of the psychologist. It's free, in a sense, of the rigid structure of the art philosopher's way of sort of dividing things up into categories. But it encompasses all of those. It gives us a way that is both free of constraints, but even more so constrained by the need to be coherent and to form a narrative that works. And this helps us gain insight into how the dramatist or the artist, the literary artist, can try to make sense of our brain and our self, which again Linden tells us scientifically and the psychologists prove empirically needs to make narratives. This is the narrative, and that's the artistic aspect of the narrative that we need to see, not the details of Shakespeare, although I am firmly in favor of having people memorize it. Moving on to COR 120, the same principles apply. So stuff in 120 is somewhat more familiar, except for Plato. Everybody, gets scared with Plato. But again, we're not trying to make philosophers out of them. We need to have them understand how a philosopher, a good old school, dyed-in-the-wool, 2,500-year-old Greek philosopher, views community. How a philosopher approaches these things. Socrates, as described by Plato, using the elenchus, this dialogue, draws us into a story that's 2,500 years in the making and still going on. The important part of this book, again, is not to become masters of philosophical discourse. My colleague, Professor Kite, can do that. He is brilliant at it. Professor Capone, they're philosophers. I'm a piker when it comes to that, but luckily I don't have to be an expert at this. What I have to do is show the students that philosophers approach big questions in a particular way that's different from the historian, from the economist, from the sociologist. They do it using methods that are different, but they all have a meaning. And so when you look at what Socrates is doing and you get drawn into that conversation, you become part of it. That's the beauty of philosophy. It transcends time and space and gets us to ask the big questions for which we may never have answers, but that's okay. It's the journey. The interdisciplinarity aspect of this is bringing all of this stuff to bear on this question, and philosophy is one lens that we can use, one way of knowing that we learn through reading Plato. We learn by following Socrates' journey, not by deeply understanding all of the nuances of a very complicated philosophical argument. But when we're looking at the allegory of the cave or the myth of the metals or the ring of Gyges, we understand that these are techniques that are being used to understand a fundamental, profound question or questions about truth, about ideals, about justice, about community. And that's what philosophers do. It's the journey for them, not the answer. A scientist is looking for a result. A philosopher is looking for questions. That's what we learn from Plato. And that's all we have to know, really, to be good at it. And when we look at Heilbronner, and we look at the worldly philosophy, the dismal science of economics, this stuff is philosophy, it's history, it's math in some ways. It's everything about this sort of, it's even art in some ways, because it's trying to understand a fundamental question of what human societies, what human communities do, which is distribute goods and services. How do we do that? We have to be interdisciplinary to approach that because it's philosophical, it's moral, it's ethical, it's economical, it's political. It's all of these things. And there's an art to it. Anybody who reads, for instance, David Ricardo or reads Smith or Marx sees an artistry there, or Bentham or Mills, right? I mean, if you read Mandeville's poetry on mercantilism and such, there's an art to this too. It's all grappling with the subject which is fundamentally interdisciplinary. Economics is a synthetic, syncretic discipline, as much like history, that attempts to focus on one huge aspect of human society. But it's a way of looking at it. An economist, and Heilbronner does a great job of showing how they evolve over the years, an economist takes a different approach to things than a historian does because they're looking at different things. It's a different approach than an artist takes. It's a different approach than a philosopher takes. Even though they may be philosophers, they may have a great knowledge of history. They may be an empiricist in some way. But they're looking at questions of community and goods and services and the distribution thereof with a particular focus, a focus of trying to systematize and to try to understand these things, which is the uniquely economic sort of approach to these things. We don't have to understand the exact details of the labor theory of value. We don't have to understand the nuances of commodity fetishism or the iron law of wages, although those things help and we need to be sort of conversant with them, but we don't need to be masters of this stuff. All we need to know is this is a great example of how you can approach this problem in a way that's different from, how, for instance, how a philosopher approaches it. Or an historian. I don't have a copy of Fisher's Albion Seed right here, but you know, the big doorstop book. Fisher's an historian with a dose of anthropology and folklore tossed in. Historians approach things in a different way from all of these other folks. It's chronological, it's sort of linear, it has to do with building a narrative, it has to do with looking at things sort of holistically, but with the perspective of fitting it all into a time and a place and a context. That's how historians look at community. And it provides a setting for which we can plug in philosophy, economics, and art, and sociology, and all these other things. And don't be afraid to go back to Core 110 and Core 120 and pull this stuff back out, because we're still dealing with these sorts of things. They're still part of our interdisciplinary exploration of stuff. History, again, is just another way of looking at it. You don't have to be a master of what happened to the Puritans or the Cavaliers or the backcountry folks in the South or the Quakers or whatever. All you need to know is, here's how historians approach these questions of community. They do so in this particular fashion, with this particular mindset and this particular narrative. Right? So, when we look at interdisciplinarity, the devil isn't in the details. The devil is really in getting your head around the fact that you are being syncretic, that you are trying to bring people together holistically to understand big problems like the self or community, using as many different ways of knowing or epistemologies as you possibly can. That's what the disciplines are for. Get out of the trap of thinking, I have to teach them a lot about psychology, I have to teach them a lot about history. You don't. I think we're doing no one a service if we try to do that. The purpose of general education at Champlain College is to build better professionals, to teach them how to meet those learning outcomes that we have of synthesis, of integration, of inquiry, of asking the right questions and knowing which tools to use to bring to bear on whichever problem they're facing. That is the core of the core. And that's what you can do, it's what we can do a lot better than we think, because we don't have to carry the burden of mastery along with us. Thanks.